Hello everyone. This podcast will take you through the Stephen Lee essay, Who Was in Control of Germany. It's the first of two podcasts. This first one will focus on the intentionalist interpretation. It will develop the key points that we've looked at in class, adding additional detail and just making sure that your understanding is secure. Okay, so I'm going to use the same framework that you use for your note making, just basically going through the answers to those questions that I gave you. So the opener was an introduction, was just basically highlighting what the debate was about. So the first question, before the 1960s, there was one simple interpretation about where power lie. The interpretation was obviously that the Kaiser and his administration were in control. Traditional interpretation, it basically made an assumption that if power was given to an individual, then that person had that power, and that was an historical assumption that historians tended to make until the early 1960s. And it's what we call the role of the individual, that the power of the personality, that the person in charge, if that person had sufficient was given power, could shape history. Now, since the 1960s, historians have split over this. The divisions are an alternative school called the structuralist school tend to argue against the previous interpretation, which is the intentionalist school. So the structuralists argue that power in terms of shaping events often didn't lie with the person who was at the top, who apparently had power, but it often events in history were often shaped by the tensions that lay in society and in the structures beneath the person in power. So we'll look at that in the second podcast. Okay, so this first podcast then is just really about developing the first argument. Okay, word of caution: just because there's a new school of thought doesn't mean that the old argument, the intentionalist argument, has been completely ignored and disproven. History is a bit like a pendulum, and it tends to swing backwards and forwards between the two. So the intentionalist interpretation, there are still many historians out there who would support it. So what is the intentionalist historian? Basically, the argument is that from 1890, Kaiser Wilhelm II reactivated the powers of the Kaiser because his predecessor, or nearly his predecessor, because obviously it was Frederick III for 100 days, Kaiser Wilhelm I very much did give power, hand power down. Wilhelm II basically reactivated it. That's why the rule of Wilhelm II is often called the Wilhelmine era, whereas the rule of Wilhelm I is often called the Bismarckian era, because he actually gave power to his chancellor. So the clue is in the name that's given to the historical period. Okay, so the nice thing about Lee, he breaks it down very logically and defines particular points, which is very useful for revision for exams. So he starts off by giving 4 pieces of evidence that support the intentionalist interpretation. He does that in the third paragraph. So just make sure we understand what those 4 pieces of evidence are, because you've got to support your arguments with precise points. The first one: he was determined to rule, not just to reign. There's a difference there. Reign implies that he has been given constitutional power, but is not actually or not necessarily using it, whereas rule means he is using his constitutional power. The second point, which is a development of the first, is the way in which he used the imperial constitutional powers that were given to him. 2 examples, okay, this first example, he used it to control the executive. Now the executive, that word the executive, is another word for describing basically the cabinet of the Chancellor and the State Secretaries. The small body of men who determined policy, that were accountable to the Kaiser, and who would determine policy. The executive didn't have power to make laws, but it had the power to propose laws. So he used his imperial constitutional powers to strengthen his rule. The fact that he could control the executive was a factor. Now, the examples of that, with the power to appoint, he forced the resignation of Bismarck in 1890. That's one example. And secondly, he forced the resignation of Bülow in 1909. I mean, he also did the same with Caprivi, but those were the two strongest chancellors, and he did force them both out. So it's both evidence to support the intentionalist argument. The next point, he also used the constitutional powers which were given to him as the King of Prussia to strengthen his rule in the state of Prussia. Remember, he wasn't just the Emperor of Germany; he was also the King of Prussia. Now, the Prussian constitution had been written in 1851, and it was pretty much unmodified. There were less restraints on the King of Prussia than the imperial constitution constrained the Emperor of Germany. And remember, as King of Prussia, that did mean he still controlled 2/3 of Germany, and he very much used those powers to strengthen his rule. And the final point, he used his powers to undermine the influence of Chancellor Caprivi and Hohenlohe by listening to the advice of personal friends at the higher level of government, in particular Holstein and Tirpitz. So again, learn the names of those two men. But those were people who basically persuaded the Kaiser to remove the chancellors, and on that basis he did. Now that's a bit of an overlap. You could argue the fact that because he was persuaded, power lay more with the people who influenced him. So it depends which way you want to use that in the debate. Okay, so that's the first side. We move to the page 2, and just pick up the key points there. What two things did Wilhelm do which strengthened his personal rule? Right, this is good, this bit. He ensured that the civil service, i.e. the administration, the civil service is the machinery of government. It doesn't make laws, it implements the laws once they're actually made. Well, the civil service, remember, was controlled by the Kaiser. It was largely filled with Prussian junkers. Now, Wilhelm II did ensure that it was staffed by military personnel, so that the administration and the military worked together. So often the same person would hold different jobs, one job in the army and one job in the civil service. Now, why is that significant? Well, basically, he used that as a means of ensuring that the military controlled the administration of government. If the same person if one person in, for example, the Prussian army also holds jobs in the civil service, it's a way of bringing the civil service under the control of the Prussian junkers. Now, the best example of that, and we'll look at this later, is in 1913 there was an event called the Zabern Affair, in which the army assaulted civilians in the Alsace town of Zabern. Now, Alsace, remember, was a French town that was taken from France in 1871. Now, it was a clear violation of the rights of civilians, and yet Kaiser Wilhelm II, in spite of the fact that the Reichstag, which represents the people, appealed to the Kaiser to deal with the soldiers, the Kaiser ignored those appeals, and effectively the soldiers got off. So that's again a good example of how Wilhelm did have the strength, and he used his position on occasions to support and strengthen his rule. And then the second thing that he did, its second really good example, was in propaganda. The Kaiser Wilhelm II was very, very conscious of public opinion, and as such he tightly controlled the way in which government policies were promoted to the newspapers. So virtually every government department had a press bureau, and so the news was always very, very carefully slanted in favour of the Kaiser, and that was very much the personal influence of Kaiser Wilhelm II, who took an interest in that. It gives the example of the Norddeutsche Allgemeine Zeitung, which is a good example of a newspaper that was controlled by the Kaiser to influence public opinion. And then next section, paragraphs 5 and 6, the weaknesses. Well, we developed those pretty well in class. So what was the Kaiser's style of ruling? You can see the points there. There's a nice little quote you could use from Lee, irrational authoritarianism, or you could use a quote from somebody at the time, Kidde. It doesn't matter if you don't know who that person is, but Caesarian madness, Caesar based on the Roman emperor, like a mad Roman emperor. So it's a nice one to learn and to use in your answer. Give 3 examples of the Kaiser's style of ruling having consequences. Okay, so the fact that his style of rule, his very erratic, almost mad style of rule, did impact on history. You could say the way in which he made arbitrary appointments, that they were just random, but that nevertheless did have an impact. You could give an example of his obsession with changing the uniforms worn by the German army. But the best example is the most famous Daily Telegraph affair of 1908. Now we'll look at this when we do the policies of Bülow, but he publicly stated that most German people were hostile to Britain, and that the Kaiser was the only person who was restraining that hostility. It was an outrageous comment. It really upset the Reichstag, who condemned Wilhelm and tried to put restraints on his power. Wilhelm responded. The outcome of that was that Bülow, the Chancellor, was sacked. So again, it's an example you could use to support the intentionalist argument. 2 major weaknesses of the intentionalist interpretation. So moving into the weaknesses, Pulitzer. You can look up who he is, but again, it's a useful quote. No man, however powerful, can act alone. The intentionalist argument tends to devalue significant contributions made by other people. Chancellor Caprivi, for example, intentionalist historians often focus on the fact that Kaiser Wilhelm II sacked him, and that Caprivi was a weak chancellor. Actually not true. Caprivi did develop a strong policy called New Course, and intentionalism sort of focuses historians away from that. So that's the weakness of it. It devalues the contribution, likewise, of Minister Pozadowski, who did a lot to introduce welfare legislation to help the poor. Again, intentionalist historians, because they become so focused on the Kaiser, tend to downplay some significant things that happened that were introduced by the chancellors. And the third one, by focusing on an incompetent individual, we incorrectly ignore the influence of broader pressures from below, which had an impact on government policies, which of course is the structuralist debate. So that's the second page. Finally, I've attached to this podcast the mind map, and of course what I've just taken you through are those features that we're looking at there. So it's a good little overview for you. We've got an overview of the changing interpretations, the first part of this podcast. Then there is the intentionalist argument, the definition, the evidence, and the personal rule, and then the weaknesses that we just finished off with. Okay, so the weaknesses, which is in part the personal style and those other factors, Pulitzer, Caprivi, the New Course, and so on. So we've covered half the mind map in this podcast. I hope that was useful to you. Now go on to the second podcast, which is about the structuralist school. I'll make that in a minute and probably upload that within the next 24 hours.